Welcome to Par Lettres, a long-form podcast hosted by Nishi Pandit and Andrew Flores, where we explore the work of Jacques Lacan through free associative conversation. Par Lettres exists as an invocation and enactment of analytic discourse, where we speak from the locus of our own desire and engagement with Lacan's oeuvre. We invite you to hear Lacan through the conversation of speaking beings, whether you are philosopher, student, clinician, or simply curious about what psychoanalysis has to offer to the cipher of our mortal destiny. In this episode, we discuss the concluding section of Lacan's essay, The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis, which he titles The Resonances of Interpretation and the Time of the Subject in Psychoanalytic Technique. All right, welcome back, everyone, for another episode of Par Lettres. We are going to be looking at section 3 of Lacan's essay, The Function and Field of Speech and Language in Psychoanalysis. This is the concluding section of the essay, so we're really excited to reach this climax, this apex of the essay. And I'll just say it is titled The Resonances of Interpretation and the Time of the Subject in Psychoanalytic Technique.
Yeah, and I don't know if you have anything to add and get right into the nitty-gritty details of this section of the essay, the final essay section of the essay, but I kind of want to recap on what I began with in part 2, specifically when Lacan talks about the 3 moments in Freud, and a lot of these Freudians and post-Freudians and even the analysts of his time is recognized are the 3 moments in Freud, but that they still map out in the theory and the technique. And that's the first Freud of 1890s up until like 1910, which is going to be the topography of the psychic apparatus, which would be unconscious, preconscious, conscious perception system. And then I was a little muggy about the second one because the second moment in Freud is a bit blurry, but in the On Further Treatment of Psychosis essay, Lacan signifies this moment in Freud as the superego, the ego ideal, and its relationship to narcissism, and reality. But reality, insofar as it's a loss of reality, right? Loss of reality is something that Freud continues to elaborate, especially in a 1920s essay called Neurosis, Psychosis, and the Loss of Reality. And then the third moment in Freud would be the one that everybody's familiar with, and this is why they get Freud wrong, is ego, id, and superego, right? Now, I bring this up because we could even say that there are these moments in Lacan. Now, there are so many moments of Lacan that we make a chronology of this, and I wouldn't say these are the only 3 moments in Lacan. Like, for instance, we have the 6 paradigms or 6 moments of jouissance in Lacan, right? But I think this is something that I could like throw out there to see if this is a vibe or not. But the 3 moments of Lacan, and this is actually influenced by a reading that Slavoj Žižek has in the Sublime Object of Ideology. These 3 moments have to do with the 3 modes of the unconscious, right? And this first moment is situated around function field in the first 3 seminars. It's the unconscious that is structured around repression, insofar as repression is the return of the repressed, as well as how the subject reconstructs the history, right? Not as it was in the past or lived in the past, but, is constructing their history through speech and language in a way that produces this future anterior effect, right? Because repression returns not in the past, but in the future, right? And we can get into this moment of the future anterior because it becomes a big theme with regards to time and this resonance. The other 2, I forget how Slavoj characterizes, but I think if I have to take a stab at it, it's like around seminar 11, we get like objet, the gap and the pulsing and closing of the unconscious when it already opens and you encounter it, it's already too late. It's already gone. There's only just a trace. And I think the later aspect of the unconscious is the formalization of the um, non-rapport, right? The absence of a sexual relationship. But I could be wrong about those two. But this is maybe just a thought invocation to play around with when we think of periodizing Lacan, right? And doing our best to do it rather than these sort of uh, really superficial attempts to be like, oh, this is Lacan of the imaginary. Later we get Lacan of the symbolic, and then we have Lacan of the like. No, like Lacan is already talking about these three registers, but the way he applies it, I think, is fundamentally crucial because he's oriented around something that we just constantly repeat, ad nauseum, is field of speech and language, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really good you brought that up, because he is very interested in the function of time in this third section. He's talking about time. He goes into the short session a little bit. He's also making references to logical time, his essay, Logical Time. And yeah, this whole question of repression, how it's tied into the analytic experience and analytic technique. And he also does talk about dialectical punctuation, as like what analytic technique is about. And just while I was listening to you speak, it made me think that punctuation is also something punctual. It's something that happens in the right moment in order to evoke and invoke this semantic resonance for the subject, right? And the purpose of that semantic resonance is precisely to engender an effect through logical time in which what is repressed is able to be spoken, is able to be heard, right? That's why he also re-explores his formulation about the fact that the subject receives his own message in an inverted form. His point being that even the analyst's response to the subject already has the subject's response is already in what they have said. They hear their own message, and even the analyst is only responding to the subject's own echo.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's also funny that in the beginning of the section, he returns to Freud's three cases, Dora, Ratman, and Wolfman, to explore what a lot of analysts really fail to recognize is how, like, yes, we could acknowledge that these are failed cases, and we could acknowledge that these are cases that Freud published to show, because Freud does write in a lot of papers, the technique, observations, but I think these cases are important for Lacan and important today to study because they are iconic cases of extreme hysteria. Wolfman, it's infantile neurosis, and then for Ratman, it's extreme obsessional neurosis. And there's sort of archetypal characteristics of what a neurosis or a hysteria may look like. Um, and also what Freud did wrong, right? And that he was really willing to show what not to do. And for Dora, we'll talk about this more in depth because he gets into it later, the effect of countertransference, right?
Right.
Uh, and then, with Ratman and Wolfman, the, details escape me, but the point of bringing up these essays is that the function and the technique of analyzing speech and the semantic teams that you were mentioning are there, right? And in Ratman, we see the evocation of resistance take place and how Freud has to sort of play with the resistance and dupe Wolfman only to make him speak and come up with these associations and condensations that manifest at the level of language, right? That have, again, the future anterior effect. And Wolfman, it's the same thing, a future anterior effect through uh the initials of like Wasp, and then for Ratman, it's like the initials of the surname that bring up this association between his father, debt, and the rat torture thing.
Right, right. And I do think that Lacan's analysis of Freud's cases is really fascinating because yes, there's limitations in Freud's treatment, you could say. And yet for Lacan, he's really trying to show us the way that Freud used semantic resonances as an analytic technique, and that he's already operating with the patient at the level of the unconscious structured like a language, and that maybe the resistances and the countertransfer, and this is a place of limitation, where again Lacan has charted new territory. The way I see that, again, his formulation of the desire of the analyst, that all resistance on the side of the analyst, that we can now be in a completely new position in relation to the subject in analysis, and the fact is, he also talks about that in this section, that the subject can come to analysis and evade the analytic experience, can evade the analyst, it's like, just because they're in analysis doesn't mean that they're in analysis,
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is it's a simple point, but I think it's like important to drive home. Like, just because you walk into the session and you lie on the couch or whatnot and you start free associating, that's not doing analysis, right? Analysis doesn't happen, when you get to the office, you lie on the couch and then you leave and then you come back. Like, you could do that for like 3 years and there is no analysis. The time of analysis is also the time of the name of the thing. What is that thing? It's what emerges, and here this is the also relates to the early moment in Lacan of 1953. Not only the future anterior, but the subject's desire that's contained in that message, right? Or the message that contains the subject's desire, which is the desire of the other that is the unconscious discourse. So once that thing emerges in that speech, that's when we could say analysis has started, right? And in page 241, I like this passage because it kind of uh, illustrates what you were saying earlier about like evading, like the analyst and evading, but also what the analyst has to do. He says, we learn that analysis consists in playing on the multiple staves of the score that speech constitutes in the register of language, which is where overdetermination comes in the latter having no meaning except in this order. And we have simultaneously isolated here the mainspring of Freud's success. In order for the analyst's message to respond to the subject's profound questioning, the subject must understand it as a response that concerns him alone, right? And that's the main thing about this, um, time of the session, or time of the analysis also being the time of the name of the thing, is that any message or that comes up in speech, this is where the signifier emerges, right? The material of speech that is heard and relayed back to the analysand. When it is relayed back to the analysand and it has that, as you said, punctuation or punctual effect, that dialectical movement, that is where the analytic session starts, because it marks that subject's time, right? The time of the subject, right? Not the time of the ego or the time I walk into the session, but the time of the subject that is produced by the effect of speech, right? And this is what makes Lacan's reading of Freud really different, because he'll say, again, from all these other different psychoanalytic thinkers, like, the person that is talking to you, that is talking in front of you, that's not their ego. The ego is somewhere else trying to uh, evade or trying to create this imaginary lure between itself and the other. But as he says, a verbal nucleus, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's somewhere in speech, right? And it's doing so much to avoid the encounter of the subject, right? It's misrecognizing itself in speech, but it'll manifest in these witticisms, these bungled actions like slips of the tongue, right? Even saying something and it being in third person when it's not in a first person singular, right? Or as we uh, see in the later Lacan, it's like the distinction between the subject of the statement versus the subject of enunciation, the I in the statement versus the I who speaks.
Yes, and he does dive into this idea that, he criticizes psychoanalytic technique, at the time in which he was speaking, that it was basically conceived that the successive treatment was something like the transference of the analyst's ego to the analysand. And he's basically saying, like, this couldn't be farther from what analysis is actually about. um, that in a sense, like, the ego is in a displaced context already, in the structure of analytic experience. That is not exactly what we're looking for. We're trying to somehow speak to. We're actually looking for the integration of the subject's desire, which they're alienated from. They're alienated from their own message. They come to analysis so they can hear their own message, which the analyst is there to punctuate. And I think that there's a couple of things here that are notable. One, this passage you read, which I love. For people who may not be familiar, Saussure has a schema where he depicts the signifier and the signified like two waves, like currents, and they're separated. And this schema, Lacan talks about how it resembles like a musical stave. Like a stave is like a staff, where the notes are written like a composition. And so again, this is all back to the phonetics. There's like a phonetic dimension to analysis. There's a phonetic dimension to the signifier. There's a phonetic dimension to what is said is what is also heard, And Lacan is very interested in this dialectic because later he mentions Huygens' clock. And he also mentioned Huygens earlier in section 2. Huygens was a 17th century, I don't know if he was a scientist or not, but he invented the pendulum clock. And this was the first like precise form of timekeeping that was available to human beings, basically, And he was like really looking into like, what is the movement? How can you create a movement that is precise, that maintains itself, right? And this swinging of the pendulum, this back and forth, I think Lacan was interested in how it symbolizes analytic experience and analytic exchange as something that's also related to time. It's dialectical.
Yeah, it's dialectical in the sense, like, because what does that mean? Like, everybody uses the term dialectical, but I think for Lacan, it's precisely this movement from um the moment of certainty or haste for certainty back to a moment of understanding, keeping you in this temporal time dimension. Time not chronologically, but logically, because it's a sort of movement of statements. Like, I think, was it the first installment where I kind of broke down logical time? It's just like the logical time would be this movement between I think, therefore, and then the last movement would be I am, which is the conclusion, right? But the thing is that, and this is not even just to delve in the philosophical applications of the Cartesian cogito that's haunted Western civilization since it first, came to being, but just as a statement itself. And we could see the logical structure in, everyday neurosis where, you know, I am a man because I have the woman, right? I don't have a woman, therefore I'm not a man. And or like, um, what makes a great American is, having a Mercedes Benz or something like that. I don't have the Mercedes Benz, therefore I'm not, an American, right? And then like if I'm not American, what am I? Like I'm a dirty communist or something like that. All these different sorts of associations, but these are like structured in a dialectical dash logical time that these two statements, and again, this is like kind of like the kettle logic, even though uh I wouldn't say it's necessarily kettle logic, but like in the sense that these two statements on their own, sure, they could have some validity to them, but then when you put them together, it's just like they kind of fold in onto themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like a sort of need to assert some type of certainty, but the certainty itself is sort of deceptive, right? And it opposes a question, an answer, a solution to get this neurotic subject out of the hell of their own logical time, right? But it's something only that they can come to conclude, right? Uh, the analyst, and here's also the funny thing is because like this goes back to like reality. It's not like this is like something that they're dealing with. It's their own subjective individual hell, and they're just not in reality, and everybody else is in reality except for them. Like, no, this is actually reality is structured like a language, and so far it's a discourse. We're all thrown into a discourse. Um, and for you Foucauldians right there, this is not the Foucauldian discourse of power. This is something else. It's a social bond. But within this, there's a sustainment of something symbolic, something imaginary, insofar as there is a narcissistic investment into that. And then there's something real in that there's something impossible, something impotent in that, but then also something real insofar as time is sustaining that concrete discourse. This is exactly how Lacan establishes the three registers on speech and language in Seminar 3. But my point being is that this type of real is quite distinct from the ego psychologists who will impose reality onto their patient based upon the healthy standards of their ego. This is also a problem because this is like uh, a sort of watered down version of like an original Freudian concept called reality testing, right? And so reality testing is based on the ego. And if the analyst has a healthy ego, then they are the test of reality. And whatever their patient is saying or doing, they're obviously not in reality. So we must dispel their illusions, right? So the analyst has the thing. That's completely wrong. And you also foreclose the subject's ability to speak, the subject of the unconscious. On the other hand, even though it's the analysand that has to do the work, has to speak and dare to know, the knowledge is not deep inside the abyss of their soul, ready to just be, awakened and integrated in some individuation thing, right? It's this combinatory effect that can only happen when you have the analyst and the analysand, the analyst who hears and listens and relays back that message in the verb form, and the analysand who speaks and does all the work, right, in the free association. But again, the third body, the third element is language, the capital O, other. This constitutes, again, what he'll formulate in that diagram, the L schema, the ego and the O as little other, because the ego is always going to alienate itself in an imaginary relation. And then you have the big O, which represents those rules and operations that language can develop. And it's also structured in the unconscious, right? And then you have the subject that has that relation to that message, but it's also blocked by that wall of language. That's also a language produced by that narcissistic investment of the verbal nucleus, as he says, the ego's identifications with the specular lure, right? So I feel like in the ego psych bros love to stay at the level of that narcissistic lure of A and little O, whereas the analyst proper is in that dialectical relation where that the big O, where the logical time factor disrupts that narcissistic investment and also puts into question of what the subject is trying to say and trying to ask, right? Because the subject asks that question about their own suffering and logical time, but they avoid the question, right? So it's who is speaking and who is, it's speaking to, right? That's the whole question that he proposes in looking at the subject versus the ego, right?
Right. And really, we're trying to elicit in the subject the speaking of their own language rather than this confusion of tongues, right? And the fact is, we have a confusion of tongues that A is alienating the subject in relation to their own desire, but it also sets up the dialectic of miscommunication, of non-rapport. And I think this logical time aspect is very important because it also leads to Lacan saying in this section, recounting that the real is rational, all that is rational is real, and
Comes from Hegel.
exactly, Hegel. And also that this thing about logical time is it is the source of anxiety in the sense that we are suspended in anticipation, right? And that anticipatory experience goes back to the mirror stage where the subject is experiencing itself as a specular image, which is nothing more than functional anticipation, right? They're not actually able to coordinate themselves, even though they cite themselves and control their own image. So this functional anticipation is, in some sense, a primordial form of alienation. And so Lacan's point is that time is a source of alienation. Time is a source of suffering. We're bound by time, which also makes me reflect on Sanskrit. Like the Sanskrit word for time is kala. Kala also
Mhm.
means black. It's
Yeah.
also a name for Saturn. There's this idea that time is actually like persecutory, a source of
Mm.
law that binds us to like conditional mortal existence.
Dang, yeah. No, yeah. Um, and it's funny that like you mentioned the real is what is rational is real in Hegel, because if there's a Hegelian resonance to Lacan, it's his movement of the logical time, right? As this sort of dialectical punctuation that never closes on itself, but it's always open. Kind of like the movement of uncertainty to consciousness to self-consciousness to um master-slave dialectic, the movement of culture, spirit, and world spirit as absolute knowing. It's this attempt to create a sort of unity of the one, but it's always open at the end. Absolute knowing is a sort of retroactive thing. That's the sort of Zizekian reading of,
Mm-hmm.
of Hegel, a la Lacan. But then you have the other aspect of the imaginary dialectic, which is the infamous master-slave dialectic, because what the neurotic, the obsessional will try to do is stay within the dimension of that narcissistic lure of the ego and the other, right? And so when they enter into analysis, they are caught within the imaginary, specular lure of the analyst has what I desire, all right? Or to put it into mythical terms, it's like the fight for prestige, right? Um, two subjects fight for prestige, and the risk is death, right? It's not the fear of death; it's that death could be the risk, and so the slave or the one who will be the slave becomes one because they do not want to take that risk. Where the one who becomes the master is that one, and so the slave then is doing the work of the master, the work of knowledge. The slave is deep within knowledge that then becomes extracted by the master as forms of enjoyment, right? So in the dialectic of the imaginary rivalry, this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something that develops from the mirror stage of being alienated in the other who produces that specular allure for you, right? But it's very frustrating. There's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of transitivism in that. It's if the other moves, I move. And so something of that has to be dealt with. And this is where this signifier for the Oedipus complex comes in to kind of stop that transitivist one-to-one ratio, as it will, but it still produces that imaginary effect of rivalry and aggression to attack to kill the other who is keeping me away from the object of enjoyment or the key to enjoyment. In analytic terms, when you're caught in this dimension, you think that the analyst is doing everything to keep you from your cure, that thing that will set you free, right? So you rival with him, her, or them. And this could take forms of just like, you know, uh, trying to point out their flaws, skipping sessions, not paying on time, right? Little petty things like that. But it could also look like um, a defense from encountering your own subjectivity by positing the analyst into the realm of imaginary identifications, in which, in some cases, in the psychology or other forms of analysis, when the analyst is thought about, dreamt about, positioned in a certain mommy daddy role, they vibe with that because they think it's all about them. Now they could project their bad object and good object onto me, but that's not the point. The point is that when they're doing this, they're failing to understand the symbolic structuration of speech that in language that's not necessarily producing that, but also what the if this is making sense, the subject themselves is avoiding, right? Because that would invoke that there is no master, that the master that they want is a dead master, right?
Right.
Freud says, what is a father but the dead father? This
Mm-hmm.
is the whole thing about the psychoanalytic myth and why the psychoanalytic myth of the father and the Hegelian myth of the master kind of are like same, because they have to deal with a dead master or a master that does not exist, but we hold within spirit.
Right, and that's why Lacan emphasizes in the section that, the slave awaits the master's death. This is also a suspension of movement. It's also anticipatory. And that this is the form of neurosis, in fact, to await, to know that death is, that they're both mortal, and to somehow think that the freedom of the slave is somehow now contingent upon the master's death. This is a definition of neurosis. And so yeah, a lot of interesting things there.
They're waiting for the right time for the to die, but it never comes, or they have to act, and like in for Hamlet, he has to act and kill now, but then, he's procrastinating. And then when he does, it's a failure. Like, when he stabs the person behind the curtain, it's not, what's the uncle's name? Claudius or whatnot.
Mhm,
It's somebody else. Right. So like, and it's funny because Lacan brings up Hamlet in Seminar 6 regarding desire.
mhm.
And so like with neurosis, it's like avoiding your own desire, always waiting within thinking, right? And not doing, right? And questioning whether if you're being or not. And then when the time is to act, it's either too soon or it's too late, right?
Exactly. And um, on this page 243, this speaks to what you were saying, this passage from Lacan. We always come back then to our twofold reference to speech and language. In order to free the subject's speech, we introduce him to the language of his desire, that is, to the primary language, in which, beyond what he tells us of himself, he is already speaking to us, unbeknown to himself, first and foremost in the symbols of his symptom.
And I'm so glad that you said that. But before I go, like, because I wanted to bring up something that I was trying to articulate in the beginning, but I got
Mm-hmm.
so lost in the sauce talking about the 3 moments in Lacan. But do you have anything to say? Because I do want to add on to that.
Go ahead.
So my second point was again something that I brought up in the beginning of the first, or sorry, the beginning or middle of the second installment. Now, if you recall, I had mentioned the passage in Seminar 1, The Nucleus of Repression, when Lacan brings up his patient who's of Islamic faith. I recommend our learners and listeners to go back to that one if you haven't checked it out. But he brings this up because, again, this has to deal with the problem of the law, right? And you had mentioned law already, and we mentioned fathers and dead fathers.
Mm-hmm.
This patient was again of Islamic background, but they were very much averse to religion. They hated religion, right? So they renounced their faith, and for whatever reason. But the key distinction is that in the Quranic law is the law, right? It's distinct from Western law that Lacan formulates, like what belongs to Caesar we must give to Caesar, and what belongs to God we must give to God, right? So the law of Christ is distinct from the law of political life, right? They could remain separate. But in in Muslim culture, the Quranic law is the law. And here's the key misrecognition of his patient's you know unwillingness to recognize the law by averting religion. They forget that. And they also forget this moment in which they renounce their faith. Now, it is also a law that if you were to be accused of theft, that your hand will be cut off, right? And so his father was a diplomat and of real high society, and lost his job and was accused of theft, apparently, rumor has it, and the thing was done to him. So this becomes a traumatic moment. So in his neurosis, he has these pains in his hand that he can't trace to any physical cause. This this has to do with the law as being misrecognized, but also misrecognized on the count that the law uh, that comes to you is one of the faith that you reject, and yet it comes back into an inverted form, and it persists by the super egoic tyranny that you will be accused and guilty, not because of theft, but because you fail to adhere to the law that you very much reject, right? That's his neurosis. Why do I say that? Well, because this has to do with the primary language. in Seminar 3, he calls it a primitive language. So in this sense, the language that comes up in the neurotic's repression is going to be something that relates to desire and refusal. And later, Lacan could say how jouissance informs that primitive or primary elementary language. In another example, he talks about someone who comes from a rural aspect of France, and their dialect is Corsican. Now they live in Paris, but their dialect is not of Corsican, right? They sound almost like a Parisian. But when they were young, the family would kind of speak in that Corsican dialect, but it would only become really pronounced when he was in trouble, right? Or guilty of something, getting yelled at. And so repression is the return of the repressed, right? And so when it manifests through language, it's going to manifest in something elementary that is akin to the way that not only language is thrown onto the subject, but the way that law and language are instantiated based upon a sort of elementary language. For the Islamic patient who rejects religion, it is the guilty upon encountering that law based upon guilty of a crime, right? Because the law and the Quranic law are same. For this patient, it's something that comes up that's infantile and relates to a dialect that was spoken at his early years, and when he was encountered by the law of punishment, of being punished for doing a bad thing, how the law of you did this or you're guilty for doing that comes from the father who speaks in the Corsican dialect. So my point about the primary language is just that that's how these symbols develop. You could like see like how you may talk sophisticated, etc., but in these sort of infantile moments of the repression coming up in speech, in negation, how it has a childlike or elementary language. It takes on like a sort of very fundamental, that's all I'll say, aspect of speech and language that's important.
Right, and I think that very nicely illustrates why Lacan's interested in language, why he's emphasizing function of speech, and why inviting the subject to speak can have such a powerful effect. As you noted, in this case, there's actually a somatic symptom. This is a slightly adjacent comment from me, but I'm just trying to say that people think psychoanalysis is just for what we think are psychoanalytic symptoms, but that's not true. Everything is a psychoanalytic symptom, potentially, and is potentially something that can be spoken to, or something that arises based on misrecognition of law, an internalization of that misrecognition, and a subsequent alienation from the subject's desire, and therefore from their own language. And so having a subject speak, is very important, and I was kind of like going on to this thread in my recent essay about acupuncture, where I was trying to say that acupuncture is a discursive act, because the points are named. And I think it does sort of reflect, in a very old way, a language, and saying that what we need to do to treat the symptom is work within a linguistic structure that's embodied. I think this is the same idea with analysis, and what Lacan is saying here, to get the subject to speak their own language, not the language of their religion, of their culture, of whatever, but just their own language, that which is already theirs, which is currently muddied in a confusion of tongues, leaving them without communication, without the ability to follow the course of their desire, right? They are averted from that, and they're actively averting it, in fact.
Yeah, no, it's funny thinking about the somatic aspect and the embodiment of it, even though it's like of a different nature than how phenomenology would talk about embodiment, right? Or the flesh, like in Merleau-Ponty. But these examples of like when you fail to adhere or swear by the law, raising your right hand, you will feel it in your hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you misrecognize it. When you don't speak of what you want, in the case of Dora, and caught in the enigma of what is a woman and all these other things regarding her father, you're forced to cough it up, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other forms of hysteria, it's these bodily conversions, right? Memory disturbances, but there is a somatic and body element to psychoanalysis that speech brings up and speech will dispel. And I find that quite interesting, right?
Yeah, I do too. It is the body that speaks, Lacan says. And
Doesn't keep score, it speaks.
exactly. Exactly. That's what I said in my essay. You're quoting me. It doesn't keep score, it speaks. And this is huge because I'm just going to critique for a second this somatic movement in psychotherapy. You know, they think that they're somehow, whether directly or indirectly, critiquing psychoanalysis as some kind of intellectual discipline, you know, so for intellectuals or something. And we're doing somatic work by getting people to feel what they feel. I'm being a little bit crude in that formulation, but I think everybody gets the idea. Um, and I just think this couldn't be farther from Lacan's articulation of the unconscious as something that necessarily exists as a psychosomatic phenomenon, as in the example you just relayed, not to mention hysteria and conversion, you know, symptoms. Which that leads me to read this other interesting passage, which is, I'm skipping a little bit later. I do want to turn back to getting into this Indian linguistics thread, but I want to finish this thread first because it relates to what we're saying. This is page 248. Lacan says, "For not only is every spoken intervention received by the subject as a function of his structure, but the intervention itself takes on a structuring function due to its form. Indeed, non-analytic psychotherapies, and even utterly ordinary medical prescriptions, have the precise impact of interventions that could be qualified as obsessive systems of suggestion, as hysterical suggestions of a phobic nature, and even as persecutory supports, each psychotherapy deriving its particular character from the way it sanctions the subject's misrecognition of his own reality." I'm just so amused by these characterizations, and I think it's such a brilliant critique of what makes something analytic and what makes it a psychotherapy, for example, that is non-analytic.
Yeah, and I mean, it also, on the one hand, when you look at modern somatic movement culture, the way that they become more crude and reductive than the scientific materialist, like all your trauma, all your psychosomatic symptoms are reduced down to your nervous system. You're nothing but just a nervous system. And I find that quite funny because there's supposed to be this holistic embodiment, but I just got reduced down to a bunch of nerves. Right. But
Right.
on the other hand, you could see that even Freud messed with mesmerism and suggestion,
Yes.
and he hit a stumbling block because of the layer of resistance that constitutes the pathogenic nucleus, the ego, right? Well, the ego is a resistance, but it's not like it's on the side of the analyst. It's actually on the side of the analyst. But this is like this movement of ego and a prime. If you stay in this imaginary relation, right? That you're met with defense and resistance, and the ego's own constitutive alienation. But when you start to embark on the path of letting the um, patient or analyst say whatever's on their mind, say anything, tell me more, do tell, that's where, the scaffolding falls down and we get at the underlying causality of the symptom, which is the subject, right?
Right. This is why in the beginning we were exploring Lacan saying that psychoanalysis is about this consumption of mirages, you know, that the subject is subjected to. And here he's saying these non-analytic psychotherapies and even like ordinary medical approaches reinforce the subject's misrecognition. They don't liberate the subject from the misrecognition that is in fact the very form of their suffering. So this is where psychoanalysis is giving us a new frontier, I think, than everything that's preceded it in the realm of a therapeutic intervention.
hmm And it's so funny because it's like, you know, we're people that are into like, Ayurveda, TCM, and all this holistic stuff that becomes a huge brand for these somatic movements. But like, y- you could get as much in a flow state with yoga, with uh modern Western Tai Chi, um, not real Tai Chi, which is a martial art, or like Qigong, or like, all these other things. You may feel that bliss, you may feel good, but what you're doing is you're still in a mirage, in the sense that these practices aren't flawed. These practices are great in their context, but these practices, uh, adjacent to modern forms of therapy, are nothing more than mirages that they produce more mirages for the subject to stay in their own alienation, never getting out of that, but just reorienting the spatial pattern of that mirage, but then also giving you an opium, right?
Mm.
It becomes another opium. You feel sedated in there. You don't feel like you're wrong. You give yourself this grandiose narrative of, I'm walking the path of enlightenment. I'm walking, I'm going to be a yogi that gets, I'm the next, white girl influencer that's going to go to India, and, I could say namaste, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to get canceled after this one. But the point is that free association produces that punctual effect, because you finally are in this moment of dispelling your own alienation. But it's not this sort of unision where you're like, I am what I am, like I feel great, like I realize myself. No, it's shocking, and it could be uncanny, or it leaves you in a state of just like an abysmal ground, a groundless ground, where your only hope is just to go back to analysis and say more to work through what was just punctuated.
That's right. And I'm just going to say this, that I think that the idea of somatic therapy, its goal of like getting us into the body, is taking us no further than a recapitulation of the mirror stage. You know, that's it. It's not going further than that. And I think that actually has some serious pitfalls, not just theoretically, but experientially, existentially, therapeutically, to somehow take the subject and say, like, what you really need to do is somehow just get in your body, be in your body. This is where the whole dialectic of misrecognition has begun, in the mirror stage. The infinite already feels that they are their body. And this is the first experience of the double, itself as doubled.
Yeah, that's a good point. Before we get too far, what were you
Yeah.
about to say about the Indian linguistics? Because I know
Indian
we
linguistics.
both nerd out on that, and there's an important point that has to tie in with this notion of the speech, the rules of language.
Correct. So, same page, 243. Lacan suddenly drops a reference to an Indian linguistic concept, and he also brings up another Indian linguistic concept a little bit later. But let's unpack this one, because I did go down the rabbit hole on this, and I think I can add some commentary. So first, let's just read what exactly Lacan is saying, and I'm going to read a paragraph above for context. And this is all relating back to the fact that the unconscious, structured like a language, means it's structured as an associative network of semantic resonances, okay? How Lacan got to this, I don't even know. I mean, I have the text that he was looking at, but how that came into his field of view, I don't even know. It's fascinating, though. So Lacan says, it is thus indisputable that the analyst can play on the power of symbols by evoking them in a calculated fashion in the semantic resonances of his remarks. This is surely the path by which a return to the use of symbolic effects can proceed in a renewed technique of interpretation. We could adopt as a reference here what the Hindu tradition teaches about dhvani, defining it as the property of speech by which it conveys what it does not say. This is illustrated by a little tale whose naivete, which appears to be required in such examples, proves funny enough to induce us to penetrate to the truth it conceals. A girl, it is said, is awaiting her lover on the bank of a river when she sees a Brahmin coming along. She approaches him and exclaims in the most amiable tones, "What a lucky day this is for you! The dog whose barking used to frighten you will not be on this river bank again, for it was just devoured by a lion that roams around here." The absence of the lion may thus have as many effects as his spring, which, were he present, would only come once, according to the proverb relished by Freud. So, this very cryptic example of the Brahmin, on the river, a girl is awaiting her lover, and she says, the dog who used to be here, that would frighten you isn't here, because he was devoured by a lion. And what the context that we're missing here is that this is a classical example from Indian linguistic texts that is used to illustrate Dvani. Dvani is the idea that every communication, has within it a conveyance. And that conveyance is not reducible to or identified by what has literally been said. Okay? So something has been said and something has been conveyed in addition to what has been said. And this is what Lacan will return to as a secondary resonance, right? And so this idea that she's telling the Brahmin, that you don't have to worry about the dog. The lion ate the dog, is her way of saying, get out of here. I want to be here with my lover alone. And her communication about the dog not being there, the fact that the lion had come, is enough to evoke fear in the Brahmin, who then we assume scatters. So this is kind of the idea that this exact communication didn't say, I want you to leave, go. I want to be here alone with my lover. There's lots of different things that could have been said. Instead she says, no, what a lucky day for you. This wild beast doesn't happen to be here because he ate the dog that would have scared you. So now the Brahmin's like, oh my God, a lion? I gotta get out of here. So that's the idea here.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's funny. I mean, these are the things that you see like in sketch comedy all the time. But this is so important. Like, and this goes back to the J.L. Austin example of how to do things with words. Like, what is said and conveyed. Um, but it's not like just to say it dumbly because you did it. You explained it in a very articulate way. Like, just this, you're saying it without saying it, pretty much. You know. Um, This is an important feature of the big O, the big other. The big other is the nucleus of speech or the locus of speech, and also what contains the rules of language. So operations like that are able to occur because of language, and not the fact that the woman waiting for a lover is positioning herself in the big other. No, she's position herself in speech and language, but the rules and operations and the way that the absence and the lover and the lion present themselves in speech, and that the Brahmin recognizes that and probably is evoked with fear, is because they are immersed in language and a discourse that sustains that, right? That's the important function of the big O, and why the big O as big other plays a role in the analysis with uh, sending back that message in an inverted form, right? This also relates to a part that I like, and it's not necessarily um, on the Devani aspect, but it relates to that example insofar as that this is an element of the big other as language and as speech. And he says right here, the form in which language, and this is 246, the form in which language expresses itself in and of itself defines the subjectivity. Language says, you will go here, and when you see this, you will turn off there. In other words, it refers to a discourse about the other. It is enveloped as such in a highest function of speech, inasmuch as speech commits its author by investing its addressee with a new reality. So, for example, the fate of marriage, and you are my wife, which means she is recognized, and also recognizing the law of language by returning the favor by saying, you are my husband, right? Uh, you are my slave. I am your master. These things that I talked about in, I think, a prior session. I think I was talking with Nick about that in seminar 3, kind of blur in sometimes with these conversations. But the point is that like this is an example of the operation known as fetus or feeds. This is speech that addresses and conveys you and commits you, and also you are to be recognized as a speaking subject. The other aspect of that, which I don't think he says, is feints, the deceptive speech. So I wonder if, in a sense, what she was doing to the Brahmin is feints, because feints is something to deceive you in a sense where, like, you say it without actually having to say it. So the joke that Freud gives of the two rabbis talking to each other on the bridge, I'm going to Krakow. why are you telling me you're going to Krakow when you want me to think you're going to Littenberg or something like that, when I know you're really going to Krakow? So why are you lying to me, right? That's an example of speech that's supposed to be deceptive in invoking the other, right?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up also because there is a deceptive element in this communication, in the fact that she doesn't say exactly what it is that she wants to say. She conveys what it is that she desires as the outcome of her communication. And it is somehow implied that the Brahmin understands not the nature of the deception, but that her communication is successful for its aim, which is to get him to leave. He doesn't need to understand that she just wants him to go. She just needs to scare him into thinking that it's not safe for him to be here. And this, I think Lacan also is very interested in it as a tale of presence absence. He's going to come back to that because, again, he's saying the absence of the lion may thus have the same effects as if he was there, you know? And then the idea is the Brahmin is there. She wants him to be absent. And so she addresses him in a particular way to create that absence by invoking something that's not even there, you know? And so this whole idea that within speech is already a symbolic alternation of presence absence, and that she says something, but what's conveyed is that actually present in her text, you know? Well, not really. It's something present at the level of a communication, you know, that is heard, that is received. And I think to bring it back to analysis, like the analysand speaks in this way all the time, in that they say things that have secondary conveyances that the analyst is listening for. At the same time, the analyst may punctuate the discourse of the analysand by saying something that also has these semantic resonances, you know, on secondary levels, that it's not literally what I just said. It's that what I said also conveys a whole realm of associations.
Yeah, no, this is good. And we can go so much into depth with this, but it also makes me think of something uh that may or may not be conveyed when we think of like Freud's jokes. And so like this one's talked about in Seminar 5. This one's funny. And I think Lacan explains it wrong compared to like how it's written in by Freud. But like it's the joke, it's about salmon mayonnaise, which is like a specific dish. And there's this guy who is always in debt, and this time he's in specific debt that needs to be paid, like, you know, right now. And so he encounters like somebody, I don't know if it's a friend or colleague or just somebody. Yeah, I think he knows them. And he happens to encounter them one day and addresses his sorrows and how he's in debt. And he says, "Oh, here you go." He gives him the exact amount of money that he needs to pay off. He says, for the love of God, I'm doing this as like, a charitable event, like in the name of God. And he's like, "Okay, perfect." And then like a couple hours later, he walks by this restaurant and he happens to see the same dude ordering some salmon mayonnaise. And he's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I gave you that money to pay off your debt, not to buy yourself some food." He's like, "What do you mean? When I don't have money, I can't eat salmon mayonnaise. And now that I do have money, I can't eat salmon mayonnaise either. So what am I supposed to do?"
That's the presence absence
Yeah.
situation, right? That catches the subject.
These moments remind me of like the type of like Seinfeld or Larry David humor. Yeah.
Right. Right. Exactly. It's like you can't win, you know?
It's like and this is a perfect example of like somebody not doing analysis. It's I forget his name, the actor who plays Hal from Malcolm in the Middle, and he's also was it Breaking Bad. Uh, but he's in an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm. He's Larry David's therapist.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know, but he's just like he's talking to him about a dream he had where it's just like he's up in heaven, he's got all these virgin women, but then he's sort of like obsessed how like the number of them, it's so odd, like it doesn't fit like his obsession. And then, the therapist is trying to like relay it back and write it down. It's so interesting that you're so fixated on the amount of women right here. And here he is just like fidgeting. And he's like, "Oh, is there something wrong, Larry?" He's like, "Yeah, I just wondered. That chair that you're sitting on, that's a really nice chair. Did you get that?" "Yeah, I did. Like, I ordered it the other day." He's like, "That is a good chair. This chair, oh my God, this chair is uncomfortable. This chair sucks." And he's like, interesting. No, you don't need to write that down. You don't need to write that down. I'm pretty sure I do. I'm very fascinated that you're interested about my chair. It's like there's nothing there, but there really isn't nothing. But this is the point where he's just like trying to find meaning. He literally says, he's like, well, I'm your therapist and I'm trying to find meaning because it's meaningful to you. He's like, it really is not. Most of the time I lie to you.
Ah, right. That's the other element here that I was going to talk about. The lie is that the unconscious, and Lacan says this, like the unconscious speaks the truth, and yet it also lies.
Yeah.
You know? And so it's like this deception, this like coded message, so to speak, you know? This is like a paradox, of course. But that's a great example too. It's like the subject is deceiving, you know, the analyst in some way, but fundamentally themselves, right? This is not fundamentally a game between the analyst and the analysand, but it is a game that's already being played at the level of language, you know? And that's what this funny little story is all about, you know? And it goes back to the early statement Lacan made in section 1, where he was saying that, you know, relative to empty speech, like even empty speech represents like the fact of communication, you know, if nothing else. Like
Yeah.
it still is the existence of communication. But what analysis is trying to accomplish is to make communication something that actually is a full speech, a communicated, something that actually communicates, you know, between sender, receiver.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he also says that, like, you know, the importance of speech for psychoanalysis is not to communicate per se and how we usually communicate information in every day to day, but to evoke, right?
Right.
Speech evokes the presence of the other in the discourse, right? And that other being the the unconscious, where the subject's message is alienated, right? Not the other of the ego, that the ego wants to alienate itself within this lure of identifications, right?
Right. And that's why he says here on 245, for in its symbolizing function, speech tends toward nothing less than a transformation of the subject to whom it is addressed by means of the link it establishes with the speaker, namely by bringing about a signifying effect. So this is that, again, this is what the Dvani is all about, is that, in other words, whatever we say, it does have a signifying effect, you know? But that signifying effect exists between the person who speaks and the person who hears and receives that message, you know? That's where the signifying effect exists.
Yeah, and I think forget what page it is, but this ties into something that I kind of wanted to riff off of. Yeah, because he brings up the Socratic method. Goddamn, I'm coughing. The Socratic method and repetition. So what does he mean by that? Well, the Socratic method, it's not that psychoanalysis is the same as Maieutic's, right? Which is the method that Plato and Socrates developed in the dialogues, where it's the dialectic insofar it's just dialogical. You have a debate, you got one stance, and you got the opposite stance. And it could end in Socrates winning. For example, in the Republic, we construct an actual theory of justice and vis-a-vis the soul. Whereas in some instances, it's an aporia, where it's open-ended, right? But what is important is this concept of remembering or recollection of something forgotten, right? A truth that Maieutic's brings up, and it's debated about in Seminar 2. But that there's recollection, and then there's Kierkegaard's repetition. And I think in that text by Kierkegaard, he says, in the history of philosophy, like, nobody has bothered to make this a concept. And I think, like, I'm paraphrasing, he's like, this is what I attempt to do, to make the concept repetition a philosophical endeavor. And repetition is just the fact that you may do the same thing, but over and over again, but you don't have the same outcome, right? He gives this thought experiment of, like, going back to, I believe it's Berlin, where he experienced like infinite amount of pleasures. And so he retraces the step and he does everything exactly like how he remembers it being, but the effect is not the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, when you repeat in speech or you remember something in the past, future, anterior, and then it happens again in your life, it's going to have a different outcome, right? But then it produced that effect. I want to tie this into this importance of the symbolic for Lacan versus the imaginary, because we've been talking about that, but what does that look like? And I'm going to give another example regarding recollection in Plato, because he right then on 242, um, at the bottom, he brings up Socrates again, and he's alluding to the Meno. The Meno is a dialogue, and I've written about this in my essay on psychoanalysis contra philosophy. Um, the Meno is a dialogue about virtue, and if one could teach virtue, right? Now, Meno is a sophist who was the student of a more famous sophist, Gorgias. Sophists were people that taught rhetoric or were paid to teach people how to speak. They pretty much don't have knowledge of anything but how to use words, right? So they could literally debate a doctor and tell them, that they don't know how to do their job and make them think that this herb will cure rather than, it poisoning. But the reality is like they don't know. And how people were getting away with murder because they were, being able to use rhetoric to represent themselves in the court of Athens, right? So Meno says that to Socrates that Gorgias is the best because he could teach one about virtue. And ultimately, he just says, like, you're wrong. Like, he gets him into a maieutic dialogue to show him that actually virtue cannot be taught, right? And Lacan says that what Socrates shows is that, yeah, Meno's a bad student of Gorgias because sophists don't teach people about virtue. They teach someone how to handle the discourse properly, right? How to engage in the speech and language act and develop a discourse that manifests into like an effect or an aim, right? That is achieved. And he then goes up to his slave boy, Meno's slave, and he's like, I want to use them to show you an experiment of how you actually learn, right? And what knowledge and not even virtue, but how one learns and what that might look like. And he's like, does he speak Greek? And he speaks Greek. That's all you need to know. So he's like, I'm going to draw in the sand a square with a surface of 4. I want you to double the surface so you can make 8. So what he does intuitively is he tries to stretch the angles of that surface and he actually quadruples it to equal 16. That's an imaginary error based upon intuition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, well, look at what you're at. What's half of 16? So you just got to decrease it twice the size and you get 8. So in that long-winded example, Lacan loves that because this is the error of one who's only caught in an imaginary understanding, um, and the failures of the imaginary misrecognition. But from that failure, the effect of something of a truth emerges because that is the effect of the symbolic articulation, right? The ability to get the answer from decreasing it was not of intuition, but of recognizing the fundamental error of that person, right? And so this is how we could see those two registers. Of course, the real is important, right? The real is what is impossible. The real is what resists civilization, and it's the trauma, etc. But what we see is how the symbolic articulation integrates itself from the failure of speech, the failure of one's own knowledge and intuition as they portray themselves in the analytic discourse. That's like why he wants to sort of extract those kernels from Kierkegaard and Socrates, or Kierkegaard and Plato.
I'm glad you mentioned all of that because he does mention Kierkegaard's repetition and then what you were saying about Socrates, Plato. So yeah, that's an important thread woven in here. And like he also says on 245 that, this is why we must return once more to the structure of communication in language and definitively dispel the mistaken notion of language as signs. Right, which I feel has some resonance to what you were just saying. It's like, how do we properly establish, what the symbolic is? And I think that is one of Lacan's principal aims with this essay and why it's something we've returned to over and over again, because he's trying to make this point that psychoanalysis is not about the imaginary. It's not about the archetypal image per se. It is not even about the subject's own image of themselves, as if this was just like the pastimes of Narcissus, you know? He's saying that no, it's about discourse. It's about analytic discourse, which is a structured communication. It exists in a field of semantic resonances. It is a symbolic, communication. And that symbol exists at the level of language and speech, not at the language of something that is identifiable, like visually, imagistically. I mean, I think this distinction is just, we can't really drive it home enough because of how important it is.
Yeah. And yeah, like as you're saying, like this symbol, like it emerges from that, right? It's a creation. It's a creative act, right? Which sounds vague, but I think this is like what's so interesting about not only psychoanalysis as its practice, but the way Lacan teaches it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough to quantify, even though he is a man that loves science, appreciates science, and psychoanalysis has a relationship to science. The scientific object of linguistics of the Saussurian kind and the object of psychoanalysis become one and the same because the language, all of the signifier, point to the unconscious. That's something that Saussure could not aim at. And sadly, Freud didn't have structural linguistics like during his time, or at least when he was still theorizing. I think like even like when Saussure was around and Freud was still alive, like he just didn't receive, that theory at the time. Like he just wasn't aware of it. But needless to say, the form of the theory of the signifier insists in his early theories of psychopathology of everyday life, even so far as to call the ego the verbal nucleus, right? Looking at the way condensations, displacements, negations, and repression as like this ideational representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
That relates to another representation, all mirror the theory of the signifier for Lacan, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so like that is like the important key in developing the signifier in function and field is to show like how Saussure's theory of language relates to Freud's discovery of the unconscious, and that the unconscious is not some like internalized thing. It's not some ontological thing. In fact, Lacan will go so far as to say that the unconscious has an ethical dimension, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because so far as it relates to desire, but that the unconscious is structured like a language, right? And it's not like it's something that's just like floating around like energy or something like that. No, it's something that emerges from the symbol, right? As you're saying, through talking, right? So you see, like in everyday, like we make, of course, they're not necessarily going to be symptomatic, but we all make slips of the tongue. We all make condensations, right? We all now it's typos, but we all do slips of the pen, right?
Mm-hmm. 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 Right. And that's why Lacan has emphasized so much, Freud's text, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, because it displays, the fact of the unconscious, and the way that it slips and slides in our everyday discourse and activities and even our experience of life. So, yeah, I think Lacan was very smart to go back to Indian linguistics as well, because this is probably one of the, if not the oldest field of linguistics, like Panini is considered to be like the father of linguistics. And as we know, Saussure was very influenced by Sanskrit. And so he certainly, was aware of Panini and all of these famous Indian linguists who had already picked up on the fact that the function of language exists at the level of the signifier. That language fundamentally signifies something. It's a signifying event, And they tried to parse that out by giving it this structure and saying, okay, there's a secondary level of language. We'll call that dhvani, the conveyances. And there's something else, called lakshana, which is similar, but it's also a little bit different, which Lacan mentions. And maybe I should go into it. He says here on 261, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I'm tying back together with the earlier example because sandwiched between that is like a number of pages and a number of other arguments. But I wanted to just make this thread, Indian linguistic thread, very clear. Lacan says on 261, the fact that numerous analysts balk at the apparent incompatibility of these terms, he's referring to repetition and automatism, might well be worth our attention, for it manifests a dialectical innocence that would probably be disconcerted by the classical problem posed to semantics in the determinative statement, quote, a Hamlet on the Ganges, end quote, by which Hindu aesthetics illustrates the second form of the resonances of language. There's a footnote here, and Lacan in the footnote references Abhinavagupta, another famous linguist who also was like influential in Kashmir Shaivism for his theory of spanda and all kinds of things. This is in the evolution of Indian linguistics. There have been various arguments and debates around these concepts. You know, like some people are like, okay, Lakshana replaces the idea of Dwani. It's the same idea basically. Then other people are like, no, it's a different idea than Dwani. But basically, the idea of Lakshana is that, again, there's a secondary power to language, you know? And I explored all of this in depth in my essay, Hamlet on the Ganges, because I thought this was a really funny, odd statement. Like, why is he quoting a Hamlet on the Ganges as a phrase? And it's actually in this text called Comparative Aesthetics, which was published right around the time this essay was written. So clearly it was in Lacan's hands. But Hamlet on the Ganges is a classical example. Like this motif occurs over and over again in Indian linguistic texts to illustrate the secondary resonances. And so what exactly is being said, you know? The actual Sanskrit phrase is, I had written this down right here, is Gangayam Goshaha. Okay, it's just two words, right? And that means a Hamlet on the Ganges. In other words, like, you can't literally have a Hamlet on the Ganges. You can't put a structure, you know, like a hut. It's like a hut-like structure as a Hamlet, right? You can't have that on a body of water. That's impossible. So there's something impossible in the statement, a Hamlet on the Ganges. And yet no one would hear this and think that that's exactly what's being said. When you hear Hamlet on the Ganges, you know, it's like on the banks of the Ganges, you know? You know, it's like, it's situated in relation to the Ganges. You're not thinking it's literally on the river, you know? And yet that's not really spelled out. So that brings us to that secondary power, you know? It's a secondary meaning that is actually very clear. It's conveyed. And something that also struck me when I was digging into this, because again, Sanskrit is a language that really shows us the signifying function of language more than anything else, I think. If you look at the word Goshaha, which means Hamlet, in one meaning, I found that it also meant the thundering of clouds, the whir of a bowstring, a sound of speech, proclamation, a cry or roar of animals, the sound of the recitation of prayers, you know? And so did Lacan know, you know, that this Sanskrit phrase also had these very intricate resonances with his own emphasis on speech, right? And he also says in here, speech is something that summons, speech is something that invokes. He's going to end this section with the whole passage from the Upanishads on thunder, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, no, that's so funny that you said that, like that secondary meaning, like that play on words, because this is what he says, like, you know, like the whole problem with like the theory of language and analytic philosophers of language is like, what came first, the thing or the word? Is there a one-to-one correspondence between the sign and the thing, or the word and the thing? Or was there just this like historical, like, you know, like they use a thought experiment, this historical moment that's called like, you know, the primal baptism. And I'm quoting from again Zizek's interpretation of this debate between descriptivism and anti-descriptivism, but it's like from Sal Kripke, I think. But overall, like this like problem in analytic philosophy of language, and trying to find the meaning of meaning, or meta language. It's like, what is the correspondence between this word and the thing that the word is supposed to designate, right? Does it always designate that? Or was this primal baptism where I just like, you know, saw this surface with four things, or it was built and I decided to call it a table, right? And so these are these like deadlocks that we come into. But with Lacan, and thanks to Saussure, because Saussure says that, and again, for the sign is this distinction between the signifier as the audible image or the material of the the auditory of speech, and the signified. And he actually places signified on top and signified at the bottom. Lacan flips it over. And signified is not the thing at all, but actually signification, right? The fact that things put into speech take on signification, right? I mean, even when you open a dictionary, um, you see a word and you see it defined by other words, right? You look at a cat. All philosophers and thinkers of language love to use the word cat. You open up a dictionary and you see the word cat. Noun, four-legged, fuzzy feline fucker. You need other words to be able to define that. So that's the Saussurean way. But for Lacan, by flipping the signifier over and making the signifier dominant, it's not so much about signification that's the law, right? It's rather differentiality and difference. Because Saussure says, okay, because of this debate of word and thing, it's arbitrary, right? There's just an arbitrary relationship that we just have to accept. And Lacan's like, yes, but no, right? Rather, the law of the signifier makes just the effects and laws of language contingent. That's why you're able to have these Freudian discoveries of condensations, parapraxeses, familial nerve, etc. And that's what the signifier does, because it relays other signification to another signification. It relays a signifier that represents a subject, not the referent, to another signifier, right? Um, and then the last thing I'll say, because of this sign thing, this whole sign and signifier thing, is that he brings us up in Seminar 1 regarding Augustine, right? Because Augustine actually, in his dialogue called De Magistro, the teacher, he has a dialogue with his son, Adiodontus, about the nature of, speaking or words. And he's like, what does it mean to like speak and use words? And it's like, his son's like, I don't know. Well, you know, what is language if not to teach something, right? And he reduces it down to signs and what aren't signs, right? And it's kind of funny because ultimately he's trying to teach the word of God. He's trying to teach Christ. Christ is always using signs, right? In the theology of Christianity, the sign of the cross, right? The signs of God, the word made flesh. But Augustine's saying like, ultimately you have signs, right? And he's giving like passages from from Virgil, and then passages from scripture. He's like, how many words are in these verses? 13, 10, right? Are all 13 of these signs? Well, no, because the word of, it's not. Or because was like, yeah, but you could be like, I don't like the word of, or I don't like the word because, and you've just made it a sign. So signs are now names, right? This is really interesting. And then he's
Right.
like, how do you teach these? Like, I forget what he says. Oh, he says a wall. Like, obviously there's not a wall present, but if you were trying to describe a wall, how would you teach me that in a sign, right? In a signifier, pretty much. Says I would just point to that thing. So right here, he's already getting to this elemental argument about pointing to the thing, right? But it's like, yeah, but this pointing is not enough, because this is now a sign. It's a gesture of a sign to indicate something somewhere, or someone, right? And obviously you're trying to point to a wall, but you're not teaching me anything about the wall. So ultimately we need more signs, right? But ultimately for Augustine, he doesn't get past the part of understanding the signifier because he's so focused on how to relate the word and the sign to God, right? But it's so interesting that he's getting to this point about like the sign, the infallibility of just pointing, right? And of placing this one-to-one correspondence to the thing and the word, but it's the signifier that's able to actually do that. And because the signifier engenders absence, the signifier engenders absence of a history, right? But a history that will be constructed, right, in speech. So I think it's kind of interesting how like juxtaposing the Hindu linguistics, and then you have the proto linguistics in the West of someone like Augustine. getting at like the function of language, right? And why Lacan is so invested in that.
Absolutely. And it makes me think about how it's not only in the Tibetan tradition, but it's prominent in the Tibetan tradition that in order to learn a practice, like the Lama will give you, there's various stages of it, but in order to just give you the right, so to speak, to perform the practice, they will recite it to you aloud. And this is considered to be an oral transmission. And it's not so much that because they've said it, now you've understood the text. It's that the saying of it carries a transmission of some kind, which you could say is transferential, and why psychoanalysis understands language and communication, and makes it the locus of the analytic experience is because it is, it's transferential. And I think that's also what's happening here in this Hamlet on the Ganges, because we know it means Hamlet when it says Gangayam Goshaha, because what else would be by a riverbank, except a structure. But when we say Goshaha in all these other contexts, it means something more like speech itself, the sound of speech, the invocation of speech. And so obviously Indian linguistics use this example to create, again, to illustrate their own argument while making their argument that this word also means speech. We're going to use it to illustrate a linguistic theory, therefore, and we're going to put it in this context where that Goshaha means Hamlet because of the context, even though we're not telling you much, which it also carries the connotation of holy, because the Ganges is a holy river. Everybody knows that. What's around the Ganges is something holy, like a temple. So now we know the Hamlet on the Ganges isn't just any old hut. It's a holy hut, It's set apart. It's special. So all these resonances are here in just these two words.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. One of the things I got lost in thought because I was just so focused on learning out about Augustine was the other aspect of that play on words of what is it in Sanskrit? Goshana?
Goshaha.
Goshaha. Is that it also represents the thunder, right?
Right.
The thunder of speech. Or like the cry, the roar. This is also important because I do wonder, after you bringing that up, if Lacan had knowledge of that double meaning, because again, addressing the fact that there's a contingency to the signifier versus the arbitrariness, he says, I think it's a version of the subject that it's the child's roar or the child's cry, that elevates the sign to the signifier, that it elevates the thing to the level of the signifier, giving it a symbolic status of indebtedness, of lack, of loss, right? And so this becomes the child's reality, the language and the symbolic articulation that will soon structure it. Fort da, right? That's the kind of what I want to drive home, but that double meaning of that word really articulates that other aspect of speech and of language that is important for psychoanalysis. The demand and the cry of the neurotic suffering that they do not want to convey, but yet it still manifests in the function of language, right?
Right. And so in Vedic texts, that thunder it's like a signifier for the sound of speech itself is something that thunders, right? And so that's why that's here. And I think you're very right to tie this back into the cry, And I remember we started this essay with Lacan mentioning the newborn's cry. That he sees his whole essay here as something like a newborn's cry for psychoanalysis, right? And so it is itself, he's doing the same thing that this phrase is doing. His whole essay is an illustration of itself, of its own argument, And if I think here for a second, why does this word Goshaha, how could it possibly mean a Hamlet and have all these other linguistic resonances like around speech and thunder? I think that really, if we think about it associatively, it's because language is a structure. A Hamlet is a structure. We don't have to think of it so much as literally the hut, an Indian hut from primordial time. That's irrelevant. It's actually just simply the idea of a very basic structure. Language is structured. It's structured by signifiers, and it's a structured event. And I think this is already clear to Indian linguists, or they wouldn't have come up with all of these concepts to describe all the structural resonances and impacts that are inherent in language and speech. And that's why Lacan is here at all, saying any of this, using these examples, throwing us these clues.
Yeah, and I mean, and like to tie it all back in, what the signifier that emerges is going to have, again, the function of, it's not like, again, because we've been saying like, okay, this is where the unconscious is at, but it's not like you're going to immediately experience the unconscious. What you're going to experience from the signifier emerging in speech in the Hamlet structure is what is absent, right? What it's pointing to.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what the neurotics structure is trying to do with repression, to ask the question but not find the answer, to be stuck, like I was just saying, in its own logical time.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to treat the unconscious and even the reality, as he says, not as some positive reality, but a negation. A negation that that doesn't want to know its answer, ultimately.
Right. And something that I was thinking of also, this pointing out, is the fact that in Vedanta, also, I think, in Zen, which he mentions Zen on just the page just before, where he mentions Hamlet on the Ganges, 260, he mentions Zen in relation to like the short sessions, like the Zen technique. And then he also is saying, by mentioning that and what you mentioned, pointing out that in all these Eastern traditions, there's this understanding that the real, what is real, or what is reality itself, cannot be articulated in the constraints of language and signification, that it can't actually be fully symboled, All we can do is point it out. We can point out the real. We can point to the real. And we use language to do that, but we're using language with the understanding that it is accomplishing the pointing. I think this is what you were saying on some level too.
Yeah. Before I had my hysterical cough.
Yeah. Having trouble speaking.
Yeah, exactly. It's pointing to something. And I wanted to highlight, going in, this passage on 250, because this is when we actually see the operations of the ego versus the subject, but yet we're still dealing with language in the neurotic and the hysteric. So the middle of 250, he says, in order to know how to respond to the subject in analysis, the method is to first determine where his ego is situated. The ego that Freud himself defined as formed by, as I've said earlier, the verbal nucleus. So like, it's not like this thing of defenses that we have to integrate, right? It's not like this sort of mental substance. It's to be metaphoric, it is a nucleus, it is a hub, but of linguistic structure, verbal structure, right? And that Freud defines it as such, the verbal nucleus. In other words, to figure out through whom and for whom the subject asks his question, right? That's the most important part. Through whom and for whom the subject asks his question. This is the alienation aspect of the subject and the ego, right? Not just of the other, but the way that the subject alienates himself in that image, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just the image of the mirror that the child sees. It can actually be the imaginary identifications that one has with an other, right? Um, this is the whole problem of the intersubjective relationship, is that it's not symmetrical, but the imaginary aspect wants to keep consistency and relation, to, this other. Um, and then he says, as long as this is not known, we risk misconstruing the desire that must be recognized there and the object to whom this desire is addressed, right? And so he then like breaks this down with the hysteric and the obsessional, when he says, the hysteric captivates this object in a subtle intrigue of her own ego, in the third person, by means of whom the subject enjoys the object who incarnates her question. This is Dora 101.
Mm-hmm.
She finds her ego as far as an alter ego of like the feminine masquerade from what's her name? Frau K, right? But Herr K is the imaginary other, right? Um,
Mhm.
And then what's in question is the father's love, but that's not the enigma that drives the question of the reality. It's what does it mean to be a woman, right? Because there's something about Frauke that she's obsessed with. And at some point, she's using her as an imaginary identification for her own homosexual tendencies, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
But it's only insofar as that Herke is married to her, and she has this sort of weird relationship, this erotic relationship with Herke as well. And so there's the narcissistic line of ego and A, and the way that she kind of positions her father symbolically, if I'm not mistaken. But it's where Freud goes wrong is he thinks that it's only about her father's love, right? That's not the point. Even though she wants the father's love, the real question that she is hides from in this masquerading of the ego in the third person is what is a woman, right?
Mhm.
On the other hand, the obsessive drags into the cage of his narcissism the objects in which his question reverberates in the multiplied alibi of deadly figures, and mastering their higher wire act addresses his ambiguous homage towards the box in which he himself has his seat, that of the master who cannot be seen, right? And so at the end he says one identifies with the spectacle and the other puts on a show, right? And so the spectacle would be the obsessional who his subjectivity is always on standby, right? But identifies with the spectacle and wants to be there, right? That's his ego ideal. I will be there, right? But I'm not there. I am over here and I'm on standby. I'm procrastinating. And then you have the putting on the show of the hysteric who acts out, right?
Yeah, this is such a brilliant summary of hysteria and obsessionality, and the way that he describes it is so interesting in relation to the other, and to bring that home about the ego, and desire being desire of the other and so forth. This is alienation. He says just after what you read, it is therefore always in the relation between the subject's ego and his discourse's I that you must understand the meaning of the discourse if you are to unalienate the subject. A very interesting sentence.
Yeah. And it's just like this whole point about alienation, like to drive it home, like you're alienated from the image, which is your ego. And that's the first alienation, the mirror stage. But then you're also alienated from the discourse in which you are sort of put in, that you put yourself in, that you sign a unconscious pact, one where there is debt, sin, right? Where there is servitude, the servitude of a master who is dead, right? And yet you're not there to take the place, and yet you want to take the place. So you try to find a master, right? The the obsessional wants to be the master, but can't because something is in his way, and he's waiting for his time, for his turn. And the hysteric wants a master, but the master who's in charge is fallible, and is not it, and they expose the gap in the other, right? This way, like Lacan will call Hegel the sublime hysteric. He's not talking about the absolute knowing as the one, but rather
Mm-hmm.
as like this sort of whole, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and all of this makes me feel like psychoanalysis somehow is able to get at the very structure of human experience and existential truth, that it concerns itself with that. It's like so much more than just unpacking what's repressed in the unconscious. That actually represents the very nature of our being, in the world, so to speak, and the fact that we're engaged in communication with others, except that we're not, we're alienated and we take the other's desire as our own, and we're in all kinds of captures and mirages instead of actually being in a relational experience.
Yeah, or non-relational as
Right, or not, yeah.
I also like, yeah, like yeah, just this point about like at the end of 250, um, the last or the second to last paragraph, um, this a relation between the subject's ego and his discourse's I, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is important because, like, we've talked about alienation, we've talked about discourse, we talked about language, but the operation between the subject who alienates themselves in the mirage of the ego and its all its sort of identifications and captivations and misrecognitions, and then the I, right? The I, which is contained in the message, right? The conveyed one, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
maybe is not directly said, but still gets its point across. And I think that is the whole thing about this teaching of psychoanalysis versus the relational one, or the one that uses the analyst's ego as the testament of reality, because they miss the fact that the subject's I that's conveyed in the discourse is also the one that gets his point across, even by lying. It is telling the truth in the lie, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
the whole thing about the liar's paradox.
Exactly. Exactly. And this is why, like Lacan says on the next page, analysis is becoming the relation of two bodies between which a phantasmatic communication is established, in which the analyst teaches the subject to apprehend himself as an object. This is his
Yes.
critique, right?
Yeah,
But
Michael Ballant. Yeah.
right, right. And what we just read on the preceding page, what you just read, is saying exactly the opposite of that.
Yeah. Which is funny because in seminar one, he has this entire critique of Ballant. His section is actually called Michael Ballant's Blind Alleys. And he actually um does give him some props because at one point he does encounter an analytic act because he receives a patient who has been with multiple analysts and just has a lot of trouble. And so, like, he just listens to this patient go on and on and on about this like extravagant story about his life, and rather than trying to interpret it, rather than try to give it meaning, he simply just says, I've listened to your, story about yourself, but I can't make heads or tails of it. And the guy just like jumps up with joy, like, my God, you're a freaking genius. You're like the first person to say that to me. No analyst has ever responded that way. A matter of fact, I've been trying to find an analyst that I trust that I've just been lying this whole time to find out, like, if, for lack of a better term, you're legit or not. And just him, let's just say, like, he's obviously in other times not being in the analyst discourse. You could say it's just a non-analytic discourse.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's a university discourse or whatever you want to call it, it is not psychoanalytic discourse that's producing the effects of the unconscious, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at this instant, we see Ballant actually like, yeah, man, like, I'm trying to like make heads or tails and this is not making any sense. Like, and so he's just like, yeah, like, no, like I've been like lying. And so there's an encounter that sometimes can happen, right? But the problem is that this is not becoming economical. This is not becoming the theme of our technique, right? Is encountering a subject that can lie and is split between an ego of mirages that are like, as he calls it, it's like an egg without a yolk, right? An empty eggshell. And then the subject of the unconscious in this I that is sort of inverted in this message that it relays. When we start with that and focus what this essay is all about, speech and language, we don't have to worry about two bodies, three bodies, four bodies, no bodies,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we don't
Mm-hmm.
have to worry about strengthening the ego and, you know, this sort of grand hero's journey narrative.
Right. Exactly. And I'm glad you mentioned the word technique, because again, that is Lacan's intention with this third section, is to really elaborate how the function and field of language and speech constitutes psychoanalytic technique, and that's why he's also spending time critiquing these other methods and also trying to say, what is it that we're listening for? Where's the discordance between the subject and the ego, between what is said and what is conveyed and what is meant and what is signified, and what the signifier is. And how do we resolve this discordance? And perhaps we don't. We simply allow the subject to no longer be alienated from their desire, right? This is Lacan's sense of the quote solution, or what psychoanalysis is really about. And nobody until then has actually made what you just described as analytic discourse, the nature and process of psychoanalysis. It maybe at times it's happened, but no one has ventured to make that actually the core dialectic.
And it goes back to also, even in the speech, these logical time moments. Like, again, he says 255 at the end. The first, when it comes to the dialectical perspective, the first, which is based on the limits of our field and which confirms my remarks on the definitions of its confines. We cannot predict how long the subject's time for understanding will last, insofar as it includes a psychological factor that escapes us by its very nature. And that's true because, like, as I said in the beginning, we were like both saying, like, the analytic discourse or the session doesn't start as soon as you walk in. It starts whenever there's that logical time effect, something being said, and an attempt to affirm and conclude the nature of one's being and one's existence, and it being relayed back and putting them in this pressurized time. As Derek Hook says, this like subject is in this temporal pressurized time where the conclusion doesn't make sense when it's referred back to me, and I'm put in this sequence of a time for comprehension, a time for understanding, right? That leaves me in this, as I said, like this groundless abyss, because I have no foundation. All my conceptions and certitudes, are deceiving me now, are fleeing from me. They don't have any weight. And so I'm forced to be in this pressurized time to constantly understand, but then I'm also inclined to make a conclusion already because of the anxiety of not being there, right? To think and to be, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I am thinking, I am not. And if I am, I'm not thinking, right?
Right. And I think that this also makes me want to sketch another thread that's in this section, which is that relative to the short session, Lacan uses language around like pregnancy and delivery. Like one is that he mentions that, and I don't know exactly where it is now, but that if he hadn't been using his short session, then he would have just been listening to his analysis going on about Dostoevsky, which I mentioned in our last session. But he was saying that he was able to recover like that subject's cesarean and anal pregnancy fantasies and such, instead of listening to all these like speculations around art and literature and things that don't necessarily pertain to what is the subject is actually there for, which is analysis. And so Lacan is saying that the short session functions as a scansion, in relation to time. And I think I'm just speculating, of course, that he's using these pregnancy language to get at the fact that the cut of the short session is actually a way of somehow stimulating, almost in like a homeopathic sense, the fact that the subject is already suffering from a scansion, the divided subject, right? I mean, the trauma of birth, the scansion of the umbilical cut, the scansion of the trauma of weaning, the scansion of the mirror stage, right? There are already all of these cuts in logical time and space that the subject is suffering from. They go to analysis, they experience a different kind of cut, a scansion that actually serves their discourse, that serves the function of analysis. And then he compares that technique to Zen technique, right? What is Zen technique about? It's about disrupting, the trajectory of the subject at precisely the moment in which it could produce a sudden awakening, whether that's with a stick or whether that's with a koan. It's a scansion of a kind that produces, enlightenment, so to speak, in that tradition. And so I think that, like, for example, like the page you just read, like then on 256, he says, after the colon, from the moment his truth's due date can be predicted. It's like back to this like idea of the subject's birth and conception and delivery, deliverance perhaps is also here. And he said earlier in section 2 that like a symptom is, language from which speech must be delivered, back to the newborn's cry. There's something of a sketch here, I think, around analysis and scansion and short session, also somehow foreshadowing the fact that analysis has an end. One day analysis will end, and how will the subject tolerate that end, or how do we arrive at that ending? And that's why Lacan from the very get-go is playing with the sense of time in which the subject is caught, and making that actually part of the analytic frame. So I don't know, I'm just free associating on this, like these threads that he's throwing in about, due date and cesarean and
Well, I thought like with that instance he's using the metaphor of like delivery due date because of the patient's own pregnancy fantasy.
right.
Yeah. Um
Correct.
but like he's using this person's symptom and his departure and arrival in logical time through what he's bringing up in the material, not the listening to Dostoevsky, speculating about art, but then when you finally punctuate, like, it's to disrupt that ongoing self-absorbed chatter, and then, you know, get them to speak. And then when they start to speak and they are almost getting close to certitude, they get whacked with the stick, right? Not literally like in Zen Buddhism, but in uh let's stop right there, or like actually say something that hits the subject, right? Um
Marks
and
them even.
that marks them even. And I mean, you were mentioning deliverance, and I was thinking of delivery in the form of a punchline. A
Mm-hmm.
punchline has an effect, right? Especially like, when you listen to hip hop, the rhyming, you get this the structure of all the different verses, but then there's the punchline of a play on words, of a simile and a metaphor. And it's like if you were to put that on top, it's not going to have the same because that's supposed to be the punchline. But then when you layer it with build up, and then you put the metaphor, there's the punchline, right?
Right. I think this goes back to thunder as something that strikes,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and it
Yeah.
strikes at an auditory level,
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally, it's heard, right? The thunder has the roar, it has the cry, it has the sound, it has the reverberation, it strikes, the atmosphere. And I mean, unless you have something in between, I was thinking maybe we cut toward the end because the end is very
Mm-hmm.
significant, Um, so the ending of the whole essay, Lacan takes us back to the Upanishads. And I, of course, found this very interesting. This passage that he quotes at the end is from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, which is one of the older Upanishads, and it's a section called What the Thunder Said. This is a section that T.S. Eliot also, he didn't quote, but he references it in his conclusion to The Wasteland. Now, probably, we know Lacan already referenced T.S. Eliot in this essay. It's very likely he also, of course, he had read The Wasteland by this time, very famous poem. Maybe that led him to this, but I think Lacan also has his own reasons, aside from T.S. Eliot and poetry, for coming to this passage in the Upanishads. And it relates to the thunder, what we said before. Speech, The fact is that Prajapati, who is the one speaking these utterances, the utterance da, he's the god of thunder, right? And so his speech has this like thunderous act. It is like the primordial form of speech itself. And it also, I think, is not lost on Lacan, of course, that this Sanskrit syllable da also resonates with the German, the fort da, right? Which is a thread in this essay too. So he's kind of playing with the fact, oh, we already have this like phonetic resonance here across the language at the level of the signifier, you know? But it's also more than that, and I'll read this ending, and then I'll comment on it. So Lacan says, psychoanalytic experience has rediscovered in man the imperative of the word as the law that has shaped him in its image. It exploits the poetic function of language to give his desire its symbolic mediation. May this experience finally enable you to understand that the whole reality of its effects lies in the gift of speech. For it is through this gift that all reality has come to man, and through its ongoing action that he sustains reality. If the domain defined by this gift of speech must be sufficient for both your action and your knowledge, it will also be sufficient for your devotion, for it offers the latter a privileged field. When the Devas, the men, and the Asuras were finishing their novitiate with Prajapati, as we read in the first Brahmana of the 5th lesson of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they begged him, "Speak to us." "Da," said Prajapati, god of thunder, "did you hear me?" And the Devas answered, saying, "Thou hast said to us, Damyata, master yourselves," the sacred text meaning that the powers above are governed by the law of speech. "Da," said Prajapati, god of thunder, "did you hear me?" And the man answered, saying, "Thou hast said to us, Datta, give," the sacred text meaning that men recognize each other by the gift of speech. "Da," said Prajapati, god of thunder, "did you hear me?" And the Asuras answered, saying, "Thou hast said to us, Dayadvam, be merciful," the sacred text meaning that the powers below resound to the invocation of speech. That, continues the text, is what the divine voice conveys in the thunder: submission, gift, grace. Da, da, da. For Prajapati replies to all, "You have heard me."
Such a banger. Like the way he just ends it with that, like
It's incredible. It's one of the best endings of all time.
Like he could have like said something like completely psychoanalytical, like that's familiar in terms of like, oral, anal, Oedipus, etc. But no, like let me just like slap the Upanishads real quick just to get my point across.
Right. Right. And he actually, I mean, this is not quoted exactly. It's rendered by Lacan, and he actually has his own commentary woven into it, like when he says, the powers above are governed by the law of speech. Then he says by the gift of speech. Then he says the invocation of speech. I mean, those meanings are there, but that's not like literally line by line what the Upanishad says. He's already commenting on it in relation to what he's saying. So
it's like his own rendition of it to get his point across.
And it's beautifully done. Honestly, it's one of the best. Certainly it's in English here. I don't know what it looks like in French, but here in English, this is one of the best renderings of that passage from the Upanishad that exists.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have in here like the gift of speech. We have the ideas of devotion. We have invocation. We have Prajapati as thunder, the voice,
And I like how he like calls it the gift of speech, and he says it more than once in this essay, because like we're doing on sidelines, the Seminar 4 stuff, but what is he entitled the symbolic as? Like the gift, right? The gift of love. Of course, it's like the gift in the sort of Marcel Mauss sense of like what creates a pact, or what creates like peace between two persons, two entities, or two clans. But in this sense, the gift of speech is what evokes an other for you to receive the message, right, in the inverted form, or to give the other what you lack and they don't want. Because ultimately, what is psychoanalysis doing, right? It's the cure through love.
Exactly. And that's why I think one of the reasons he was drawn to this is that there's this energy of the blessing, right? Like he's the divine voice. Prajapati is the divine voice. And as such, in some sense, he's instituting the name of the Father, And he says the same syllable to the demons, the humans, and the gods, but they each hear their own message, And then he confirms to them, indeed, they have heard what he has said, And so like nowhere better is their demonstration of exactly what Lacan is saying the nature of discourse is,
Yeah.
And I'm going to weave in this other thing because I happened across it, that in Seminar 18, Lacan talks about thunder. He mentions this passage, he says...
he's talking about the Chinese character for thunder, right? Or is it...
He's saying he's on Descartes and meteors.
That's right. Yeah.
And he says the most typical and earliest meteor, the one that is indubitably linked to the very structure of discourse, is thunder. There was nothing fanciful in the fact that I ended my Rome discourse by evoking thunder. There is no name of the Father that is tenable without thunder, and everyone knows that it is a sign, even if we don't know what it is a sign of. It is the very picture of semblance.
Which is interesting that it's thunder versus lightning.
Right.
Because thunder comes after lightning.
Right. Right. It's interesting, isn't it? Like lightning is
Yeah.
visible. Thunder is just at the level of sound.
Yeah. And yet, like, it has this roar and this impact. Like, it's like, what is it? Yeah. This, like,
Exactly. And I think him saying there about the name of the Father, I mean, in my essay, I went deeper into this idea that the syllable da, which means to give, you know? So again, like him talking about the gift of speech and so forth is actually true to the meaning of the syllable. And it also is like part of my spiritual teacher's name, Adida. He also pointed to this syllable as being like a primordial signifier of the divine, you know, of this idea that what is divine or what is real is something given in a dialectic of like giving and receiving, like a gift, you know, the gift of speech, thunder.
mm-hmm. It's
So
also funny, you can't spell dad without da, you know, so the name of the father.
name of the Father, you know, and the
What
fourth
does the
da
child
is
say?
there.
Dot, 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 dot. Yep.
It's often like one of the first words that, you know, infants learn to, or syllables that infants learn to vocalize, right?
hmm
So it's
hmm
interesting. It is this kind of like primordial vocalization as well.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's just, it's mysterious. It's interesting. It's also taking, I feel, this whole essay, this whole argument into something that is approaching the real, that is approaching psychoanalysis as a field that could move into something invocatory, right? Sacred, even.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to like the point that I made about like psychoanalysis for Lacan having its relationship to the oracular tradition of oracular knowledge, like especially like the Oracle of Delphi of know thyself, where it has this sort of thunder-like impact onto Socrates of what that may mean. And so now he's just going around town saying that all I know is that I know nothing, and then putting his interlocutors into a dialogue, right? That's
Exactly.
like it has this effect, but it doesn't necessarily give the subject meaning, right?
Right. The meaning is like at the level of what is heard, right?
Exactly.
Which is unique to each hearing.
hmm
And so the fact that there is this, you know, before psychoanalysis, there's a gap between what is said, what is heard, what is understood, you know? Here in this Upanishad, you know, parable, what is said is heard and understood,
hmm hmm
right? And that's what the gift is. It's like a transmission.
Yeah. Yeah. We just hit 2 hours again.
Perfect.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks everyone
Yes.
for listening to our series on function and field. This wraps up that entire series for us over 3 episodes, which this epic essay, I'm really glad we inaugurated with it. I'm also glad that we concluded it on the Lunar New Year of the Fire Horse and on an eclipse day. I think all of that is just happened to be that way, and I think it signifies, you know, the way that we're exploring the intersections of psychoanalysis.
Mhm. And it's also funny it's on the New Year because like it's fire, right? So the fire has that spark, right? That creation effect of language. I mean, the horses obviously don't really make the lion's roar sound, like has that thunder effect, but like the stampede of just like their feet, you could hear from the distance. Like, what is that? You know, the distance of the call of, you know, one's one's own symptom, you know, their own unconscious in the distance coming at them.
It reminds me of that passage somewhere in the Decree where he talks about the gazelle's footprint. And also, like I was saying some colleagues earlier today, that the year of the fire horse 60 years ago, 1966, was when Lacan published the Decree. So this is all momentous and synchronous, you know, and maybe a new kind of cry.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. I'm excited for the next essay.
Same. All right. Stay tuned, guys.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Parletra. If you enjoyed this conversation, consider subscribing to our Substack at parletrapress.com or follow us on YouTube and Instagram at Parletra Podcast to stay tuned for our next episode.